The ambush didn't erupt, it leaked. It started with the subtle, insidious pop of 3 carefully placed rounds that silenced the point man and the sergeant trailing him. Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines had been moving through the A Shau Valley for 48 hours, the rain constant, turning the trails into slick, red clay ribbons. Now they were pinned flat in a flooded rice paddy, an area the maps simply labeled low ground. Sergeant Elias Vance, crouched behind the sweating, oily weight of his M60, knew immediately this wasn't a standard meeting engagement. The NVA weren't assaulting. They were waiting for them to move, feeding them precision shots every 30 seconds, just enough to keep heads down, just enough to ensure the panic started to breed. Vance watched Lieutenant Shun, barely 23 and already looking 50, crawl back towards his position, face masked in mud. "We're locked, Sergeant," Shun rasped, the sound barely audible over the relentless drumming of the monsoon. "They've got the treeline zeroed, requesting immediate air support to burn the ridgeline." Vance knew better. The ceiling was lower than a snake's belly. Air support was a fiction. The initial order came crackling through PFC Miller's barely functional PRC-25. Hold position. Maintain static perimeter. Do not engage aggressively. Conserve ammunition until positive identification of assault vector. Vance felt a cold dread deeper than the muddy water, soaking his fatigued trousers. The enemy didn't need an assault vector. They had patience. They had simply ordered the Marines to stay in the kill zone. The first agonizing hour was defined by the stillness. Every man was a statue in the water, only their eyes moving, searching the impenetrable green wall 60 meters away. Vance pressed his cheek against the damp metal of the M60, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, waiting for the one movement, the one mistake that would allow him to respond, but the treeline offered nothing but shadow and the occasional, mocking puff of smoke that vanished instantly in the downpour. This wasn't combat. This was being caged while the cage itself slowly filled with water and dread. The mud was already swallowing the boots of the dead, erasing them before they could be retrieved. Vance counted the seconds between the sniping shots. 42, then 51, then 37. They weren't using automatic fire because they didn't need to. They were forcing the Marines to fight the waiting itself. The battlefield became defined not by the noise of battle, but by the agonizing lack of it, punctuated by sharp, surgical violence. The rain muted everything. The distant thunder, the muffled curses of the wounded, even the sound of the rounds leaving the treeline. What pierced the silence was the specific wet, sickening sound of an AK-47 round impacting flesh or bone, a sound that immediately generated a wave of internal terror among the trapped men. PFC Miller, the radio man, was practically buried in the mud beside Vance, fighting a losing battle to keep the radio dry. His voice was a thin, high whine of desperation as he repeatedly tried to punch through the atmospheric interference to talk to battalion command, hours away. Negative on the fast movers, actual. Visibility 000, he whispered, slapping the radio casing in frustration. The psychological warfare was relentless. The enemy fired a single burst, waited 10 minutes, and then fired another single burst 2 feet away from the first. It wasn't about killing quickly. It was about ensuring no one felt safe enough to shift their weight, bandage a wound, or even blink for too long. Vance watched Specialist Reardon, 3 positions down, start to shake uncontrollably, his gaze fixed on a small stream of blood that was slowly diluting into the muddy water originating from the man next to him. Vance wanted to yell, to order a retaliatory volley, anything to break the unbearable stasis, but the order held fast. Conserve ammunition. The M60 belt hanging across his chest felt heavy and useless. He was a guard dog, forbidden to bark. The most dangerous sound wasn't the enemy's fire. It was the soft, continuous of the rising river behind them, cutting off the last vestige of retreat. Vance knew they had to move soon, but the cost of violating the command to hold static was the cost of unleashing a full NVA volley on men already exposed and half paralyzed by fear. The duality was a torture: fight and die fast, or wait and die slow. Vance's position, centered on a low, partially submerged embankment, was the heart of the perimeter, the dragon's nest. His M60 was their only true heavy deterrent. He was responsible for making the enemy believe they couldn't advance, even if they knew he was conserving every precious link of 7.62 millimeters. The barrel was slick with condensation and rain. He could feel the cold radiating from the metal through his soaked gloves. He fixed his gaze on a patch of dense undergrowth where he suspected the primary sniper had positioned himself, a barely perceptible fold in the green where the ferns looked slightly pressed down. He calculated the wind, the bullet drop, and the distance, running the scenarios through his head. If he fired, he exposed himself fully, drawing all attention. If he didn't, the sniper would continue the systematic thinning of their ranks. The NVA's tactic was masterful in its simplicity. They targeted the men based on function. First, the two lead scouts, then the grenadier who could lob cover. Now they were working on the machine gun teams, forcing them into immobility. Vance felt a profound, chilling kinship with the weapon he gripped. The M60 was designed for overwhelming violence, for breaking assaults, for dominating territory. Here, it was reduced to a scarecrow, a heavy, cold bluff. The definition of a firefight had been twisted. It wasn't about the exchange of fire, but the exchange of wills. Vance realized the enemy was playing a game of chicken where the prize was sanity. He fought the urge to empty a 50-round belt into the treeline, not because of the order, but because the silence, the controlled menace of the enemy, had become more terrifying and effective than any volume of fire could be. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They were not waiting for the NVA to attack. The NVA was waiting for them to break and move so they could finish the job quickly. His mission was not suppression. It was pure, unadulterated endurance. The environment itself turned into a secondary, equally lethal enemy. The rice paddy, originally just knee-deep, was now chest-high in the lower sections, thanks to the incessant rain and the rising flow of the nearby creek, which was now a muddy brown river. The mud had seeped into everything: weapon mechanisms, ration packs, boots, and crucially, communications equipment. PFC Miller frantically tried to bail water out of the radio components with his helmet, knowing every failed minute meant they were more isolated. The cold was unbearable, a pervasive, bone-deep ache that sapped strength and focus. Hypothermia started to set in, clouding judgment. They were sinking literally and figuratively. Lieutenant Shun, maintaining a desperate facade of control, had to make a horrific call. He ordered the men to ditch any non-essential gear: extra ammunition for rifles, certain medical bags, even water purification tablets, to create makeshift buoyancy bags for the few operational radio components and the remaining flares. The river, which had offered the faintest possibility of retreat earlier, now raged, filled with debris and strong enough to drag a man under immediately. They were trapped in a triangle of death: the enemy ahead, the rising water behind, and the suffocating command to stand still above them. Vance watched one of the younger Marines, Private Jenkins, start coughing a wet, ragged sound. The moment Jenkins moved his head to clear his lungs, a round cracked past his ear, spraying mud across his helmet. The message was clear: no environmental discomfort, no physical need, justified movement. The water continued its relentless, slow ascent, chilling the ammo belts draped across Vance's chest. He looked at the few remaining ration packs, soaked and useless. The waiting wasn't just physical, it was starvation, exposure, and isolation, all packaged into one miserable, muddy patch of earth. He tightened his grip on the M60, realizing that if they didn't move soon, the water would destroy their ability to fight, even if the NVA didn't. They were drowning in place. Just past noon, the tempo changed slightly, escalating the psychological pressure to an unbearable level. The NVA began targeting specific vital equipment, proving they had accurate observation posts locked onto the perimeter. A single round struck the antenna of the backup radio, bending it uselessly and sparking brief static before silence returned. Then, another shot precisely shredded the canvas flap covering the primary medical kit carried by Doc Peterson, rendering half the sterile bandages useless in the mud. This wasn't random fire. This was tactical destruction. The enemy knew exactly who was where and what resources they possessed. The most devastating blow came shortly after. PFC Miller, shivering violently, was whispering a message into the radio handset, his face inches from the plastic casing. A high-velocity round slammed into the top of the radio, exploding the battery pack and sending shrapnel whistling around Miller's head. Miller screamed, not from a direct hit, but from the shock of the destruction of their last viable link to command. The symbol of their ordered wait was gone, instantly demolished. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying. Lieutenant Chun, seeing the ruin of the radio, looked physically ill. The order to stand still now hung in the air, divorced from any mechanism of withdrawal or reinforcement. It was an abstract, lethal directive. The enemy had successfully blinded and deafened them, confirming Vance's grim assessment. They were cattle in a pen. Vance used the ensuing moments of relative silence, the NVA waiting to see the effect of their strike, to crawl closer to Chun. "Lieutenant," Vance hissed, the cold mud squishing under his movement. "That order is dead. If they knew we were holding, now they know we are cut off. They're setting up for the final approach, whatever it is." Chun, however, was paralyzed, caught between the absolute, sacrosanct duty to follow command and the visible, muddy reality that command had just signed their death warrant. The destruction of the radio was the turning point, signaling the final phase of their torment. Night descended like a wet, freezing shroud. The darkness was absolute, relieved only by the sudden, terrifying illumination of enemy tracers used sparingly to check the Marine positions. Each red streak was a violent tear in the blackness, revealing the miserable tableau. Faces smeared with mud, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, men huddled together against the cold and the constant threat. The temperature dropped sharply, dragging the men further into hypothermia. The waiting became a battle against internal chaos. Vance could hear the ragged breathing of the men closest to him, the sounds distorted and amplified by the mud. He realized the NVA were changing their pattern again. They stopped firing for prolonged periods, sometimes 30 minutes at a stretch, forcing the Marines to strain their ears into the oppressive silence, waiting for the inevitable crack. This was the most effective psychological tactic yet. The cold, the exhaustion, and the profound silence began to break the weakest minds. Corporal Hayes, trapped 20 meters to Vance's left, started to moan, a low, guttural sound that rapidly escalated into a full-blown scream. "We gotta move. We gotta run." Hayes tried to push himself up, an irresistible instinct taking hold. Vance had to react instantly. He threw his body over the M60, scrambling forward through the sticky mud. He reached Hayes just as the corporal was raising his head and slammed his helmet down, pinning the man in the mud. "You move, you die. You move, we all die." Vance spat the words into Hayes' ear, tasting the mud in fear. The ethical dilemma was agonizing. Vance had to physically suppress his own man, potentially injuring him further to enforce the suicidal order of stillness. The moment the sound of Hayes' struggle subsided, 2 quick rounds zipped through the air exactly where Hayes' helmet had been moments before. The NVA were listening, waiting for just such a desperate break. Vance lay there, shaking, not from the cold, but from the terrible realization that holding the line meant becoming an executioner to preserve a tactical advantage that was rapidly disappearing. Just after 0200, a distant, muffled roar signaled a brief but glorious reprieve. A support aircraft, likely diverted far off its original course, dropped a flare. The magnesium burned bright, slow, and terrible, hanging over the valley for what felt like an eternity, bathing the flooded paddy in an otherworldly, searing white light. The illumination was a double-edged sword. It provided the Marines a moment of orientation and relief from the claustrophobia of the dark, but it also clearly revealed their desperate state to the enemy. Vance, shielding his eyes, used the light to scan the treeline. What he saw confirmed his deepest fears. The NVA were not just holding static. They had used the hours of enforced stasis to maneuver. About 30 meters in front of the line, just beyond the thickest mud, Vance saw glints of metal and the unmistakable, freshly disturbed earth around the base of the trees. They were setting up anti-personnel obstacles, likely claymore mines or expertly concealed punji stakes, possibly combined with tripwires, effectively turning the 60 meters of open mud into an absolute, impenetrable kill zone. The enemy wasn't planning a frontal assault. They were planning to keep the Marines pinned until they starved or drowned, and if they tried to break out, they would run headlong into their traps. The wait was not strategic for the Marines. It was a deadly operational delay for the enemy, allowing them to consolidate their victory without expending heavy ammunition. Vance pointed this out to Chun, who was paralyzed by the revelation. The enemy had been banking on the chain of command, relying on the predictable obedience of the U.S. Marines. "Lieutenant," Vance whispered urgently as the flare began to sputter and die, plunging them back into darkness. "We have been ordered to stand still so they could build our coffin around us. We move now, or we don't move at all." Lieutenant Chin's face, pale even in the dark, finally showed the strain of overriding command. He had watched the river rise, the radio shatter, and the NVA build their perimeter of death. The order to stand still, which had been the anchor of their survival, had become the tool of their destruction. Chin knew the tactical doctrine mandated holding ground, but the operational reality was a slaughter. He looked at Vance, the cynical, granite-faced machine gunner, who had been the only truly stable element in the perimeter. "If we stay, we die of exposure, or they come through the gap and execute us. If we break out, we might lose half the company in 30 seconds, Chun said, his voice raw. Vance didn't hesitate. "If we stay, we lose all of us, Lieutenant. We have to hit them where they don't expect it. They've locked the front. They think the river is too fast behind us. We use the river, sir. We use the fastest, shallowest run. And we use every single round of the M60 to buy us 10 seconds of noise and movement." Vance proposed a radical, desperate plan. A concentrated, maximum volume burst of fire from the two remaining M60s and all available riflemen, aimed high into the treeline, not to kill, but purely to create massive noise and confusion. Simultaneously, the company would abandon their static position and execute a controlled, staggered breakout, not towards the bank, but into the raging river, using its chaotic current for immediate, desperate cover. The plan required violating every military instinct, running towards the fastest current, wasting precious ammunition for noise, and deliberately abandoning the established perimeter. Chun swallowed hard, the weight of the company resting on his shoulders. He finally nodded, a minute gesture of acceptance. "Vance, you have 3 minutes to coordinate the fire. Miller, you and Doc are on the far left flank. We go on my signal. And Sergeant, you are laying down the hellfire. Do not stop until the belt is empty or we are across." The transition from agonizing stasis to explosive, violent motion was jarring, almost disorienting. The waiting ended not with a whimper, but with the roar of heavy weaponry. Vance braced low in the mud, took a deep breath, his knuckles white against the M60's grip. Chun yelled the signal, a primal sound lost instantly in the noise. Vance depressed the trigger and held it down. The M60, which had been reduced to a quiet threat for nearly 20 hours, roared back to life, spitting flame and tracers in a continuous, deafening stream into the pre-marked sector of the treeline. The two other machine guns joined in, followed by the high-pitched crackle of M16s, emptying their magazines in a sustained, desperate volley. The goal wasn't accuracy, it was chaos, noise, and sheer volume. Vance burned through 100 rounds in the first 15 seconds, the smell of cordite mixing acridly with the stench of the mud. The NVA were visibly stunned by the sudden, massive expenditure of ammo. Their disciplined, precise sniping gave way to panicked, blind bursts of automatic fire aimed at the location of Vance's muzzle flash. But the Marines weren't there anymore. They were moving, a desperate line of men low-crawling through the deepest, muddiest part of the paddy, abandoning their rifles and packs that snagged in the muck. The firestorm created by Vance bought them the necessary seconds. They hit the riverbank, not as an organized line, but as individual men plunging into the frigid, churning water. The current was brutal, instantly sweeping away 2 men who lost their footing. But the chaos was working. The NVA were still focused on suppressing the abandoned perimeter. Vance held the trigger down until the M60 sputtered, the belt feeder running dry. He scrambled up, tossing the hot weapon aside, and dove into the current, driven forward by the desperate knowledge that the enemy would realize their mistake any second now. He grabbed hold of the jacket of a struggling Marine, pushing them both into the turbulent, muddy embrace of the river. The noise from the treeline was now a continuous, enraged roar, but it was aimed at empty mud. They hit the far bank scattered, gasping, and half-drowned. Vance pulled himself out of the current, his muscles screaming from the exertion and the extreme cold. He immediately scanned the line. Only 7 men were visible and accounted for, including Lieutenant Shun, who was coughing uncontrollably. The rest were scrambling out of the water further downriver, injured or separated. The breakout had been successful, but costly. Vance paused, shivering violently, and looked back across the river at the swampy, miserable patch of ground they had abandoned. The NVA, realizing the Marines had fled, were now pouring indiscriminate fire into the static perimeter, firing wildly at the spots the men had occupied for the last 20 hours. The silence of the wait had been replaced by the roar of frustrated enemy anger. The firefight that never stopped, the agonizing psychological battle of inches and seconds, only ceased when they made the conscious choice to move. Vance picked up a discarded M16, checked the action, and looked at Shun. "We're clear of the immediate threat, Lieutenant. We need to move fast before they flank us upriver." Shun nodded, his eyes haunted. They were safe for now, miles from any support, surrounded by the deep jungle. But the true scar was the realization that the most grueling combat of the entire war had been the period of absolute, enforced stillness. The memory of the mud, the cold, and the sound of the rounds impacting just inches away while they were forbidden to react was the echo they would carry forever. They had survived the battle against the enemy's bullets, but the internal war against the order to stand still had nearly broken them. They began their slow, painful climb up the opposite bank, leaving the dead and the maddening silence of the rice paddy behind.